American Kleptocracy, written by Michel. Kleptocracy by the numbers. Estimated amount of private wealth located in global financial secrecy jurisdictions, $24 to $32 trillion. Total percentage of global wealth held in offshore financial assets, 10%. Amount developing countries have lost in unrecorded capital flight since 1980, $16.3 trillion. Annual global foreign aid, $135 billion. Total number of companies formed in Delaware, 1.5 million. Top-line estimate of assets held in anonymous South Dakota trusts, $900 billion. Percentage of U.S. in which anonymous real estate purchases are still legal, 98%. Total amount Donald Trump properties made from clients matching money laundering profiles before 2016, $1.5 billion. The country most complicit in helping individuals hide their finances, according to the Tax Justice Network, the United States of America. Prologue. Too big to see. The rich were just the tracer dye in the water, the clearest evidence of cultural drift. Michael Lewis. When Teodoro Ngama Obiang Mange was growing up in the small Central African country of Equatorial Guinea, he appeared to have it all. He was born with power. Since the late 1970s, his father had run the country as a despot, overseeing a murderous regime buoyed and financed by unending flows of crude oil. As a result, Teodoro enjoyed flaunting his wealth however he could. He had diamond-studded Rolexes and hilltop mega-mansions. He owned fleets of high-end cars, Lamborghinis, Maseratis, you name it, which he steered around the nation's capital, Malabo, attracting the interest of struggling street peddlers, impoverished shop owners, and the emaciated schoolchildren who populated the streets. He had women on his arm, from places as far away as Spain, Brazil, France, or even the United States. He poured money into private jets and bespoke suits and parties that would last for days on end, and told confidants about plans to build 200-foot yachts fitted with shark tanks. He even dreamed of one day creating an international entertainment empire, setting himself up as the Jay-Z of Africa. Frankly, he had more wealth than he knew what to do with, less a big fish in a small pond, and more a giant whale in an impossibly small puddle. But there was, behind it all, an insecurity impossible for Teodoro to escape. A trembling lack of self-worth, which everyone around him could pick up on. A feeling that he could never quite measure up, either to his father, or to the billionaires he met with, traveled with, or consorted with. Much of that insecurity came from the fact that Teodoro's father, now the longest-serving dictator in the world, never thought much of his son. Ignoring him, talking down to him, the dictator treated his son as he did many of his other underlings, dismissively, as nothing more than an imbecile, with as little talent as he had acumen. While his father tortured political opponents and jailed journalists, eliminating opposition and laying the groundwork for his heir apparent, Teodoro lacked the discipline and focus of a leader in training. He was always more interested in playing with his luxury cars or indulging in yet another week-long drug binge with his friends and hangers-on than in perfecting the skill set required to oversee a modern dictatorship. When his father tried to teach him the details of foreign policy or how to manage the country's economics, Teodoro would try to pay attention, but, still groggy from the night, or week, or month before, he couldn't get it to stick. Constantly hungover or strung out, he showed little promise, and constantly left his father embarrassed and angered at his son's incompetence. Teodoro is so stupid, so self-indulgent, so selfish, that discretion is the last thing that he has, said one investigator who has followed Teodoro's exploits over the last 2 decades. I think Teodoro, a man now pushing into his 50s, reached his potential maturity when he was about 10. That rampant insecurity also had to do with the reality that so much of Teodoro's wealth, which may now stretch into the billions, was so obviously, so transparently ill-gotten, that it was so clearly tied to his father's bloody, savage rule, which allowed only his family and a handful of others in their small, nub-shaped country to profit, that it came about only because his father controlled the levers of power in Equatorial Guinea, a country whose state-run media referred to the dictator as a god, a man in permanent contact with the Almighty. Despite being the country with the highest per capita GDP on the continent, Teodorin's Equatorial Guinea now has one of the lowest life expectancies, 58 years, and highest infant mortality rates, 6 deaths per 100 live births, in the world. The money in Teodorin's pockets wasn't illegal per se. Given the nature of his father's dictatorship, everything he and his family did was technically legal according to Equatorial Guinean law. But this money was illegitimate, pilfered from his country's treasury, stolen from the people it should have served most, available only because he was the son of a dictator, and everyone, both domestically and internationally, knew it. No matter how much money Teodorin threw around, no matter how much he was worth, his money would always be tainted, which points directly to the final reason for Teodorin's insecurity. With his dark skin and charcoal eyes, Teodorin, born in 1968, came of age when the only members of the billionaire class were Europeans or North Americans, when wealth was, in essence, white. Sure, there were members of the moneyed class who were non-white, but they tended to be either fellow tyrants, like Haitian dictator Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier, estimated to be worth nearly $1 billion, or the neighboring megalomaniacs, such as the Democratic Republic of Congo's Mobutu Sese Seko, worth upward of $5 billion, and whose name translates to the all-powerful warrior, who because of his endurance and inflexible will to win, goes from conquest to conquest, leaving fire in his wake. There was one figure, though, who by the mid-1980s proved that the world of stratospheric wealth wasn't reserved only for the lily white: Michael Jackson. The pop singer may have been American, but he, his reach and his status, his music and his model was global. He was an icon in corners of the world that Americans had never heard of. That was especially true for the rising post-colonial nouveau riche generation emerging in sub-Saharan Africa. From an early age, Teodorin wanted to give this air of being cool, being a big star. Tutu Alicante, an Equatorial Guinean activist who's arguably done more than anyone to highlight Teodorin's crimes, told me. And Michael Jackson was a global sensation for young kids in Africa to see. To see this black kid become so successful. Which is why when Jackson died in the summer of 2009, Teodorin spied an opportunity. He came up with an idea that would help with multiple aims simultaneously. How to transform his suspect money into perfectly clean, perfectly legitimate assets. How to honor the man who showed that being black and wealthy was perfectly acceptable. How to take a significant step toward becoming the celebrity mogul he'd long dreamed of being. And how to try to convince his father that, actually, he knew what he was doing with his money, and that he could be trusted whenever the time came for transition in Equatorial Guinea. It may not have been a wise plan. It's unclear exactly why Teodorin thought his father would look at Michael Jackson memorabilia as a sign of his son's abilities, but it was his plan, and he was determined to succeed. At the time, Teodorin already had a massive Southern California mansion, a private jet and fleets of million-dollar automobiles, and many of the other trappings that came with modern celebrity. Now he would take the next step. He would become the world's largest collector of Michael Jackson memorabilia, and in doing so, he would help convert some of his family's dirty lucre into legitimate assets and take another step toward transforming himself from African despot to international celebrity, and prove to his father that he possessed some of the acumen that everyone else assumed he lacked. He would look to the country that had already welcomed some of his dirty millions with open arms, with little to no scrutiny, a country that had perfected the biggest system of transforming dirty, suspect money into perfectly legitimate finances and assets, obscuring its illicit origins in the process. A country that was so good at it, in fact, that Teodorin was far from alone. Many other wealthy and corrupt individuals had been cashing in for decades. He turned to the United States of America. Around the same time, in June 2010, a whiskered, fleshy-faced 23-year-old named Chaim Shoket touched down a world away in Cleveland, Ohio. As Shoket walked past the baggage claim and through the airport's sliding doors, the summer sky yawned over him. A low breeze off Lake Erie curdled around the city, cutting a bit of the humidity already forming. He hopped in a waiting car, closed the door, and began his ride downtown. At first blush, there was no real reason for Shoket to be traveling to a place like Cleveland. He had no real connections to the city or to the Midwest that anyone knew about. He lived in Miami, where he graduated from the Rabbinical College of America with a degree in Judaic studies. But there he was, nonetheless, arriving in Cleveland, on an investment trip, he claimed, funded by his parents' money. According to those familiar with his operations, he had one aim: to become the biggest real estate holder Cleveland had seen since the days of the great American oil magnate John D. Rockefeller. At the time, the real estate market in Cleveland, considered a second-tier market behind the metropoles of New York or San Francisco or Dallas, was reeling. The 2008 financial crash had wiped out investment interest in the city. Already declining by the turn of the century, Cleveland saw any potential for a turnaround obliterated by the Great Recession. During those years, you could shoot a cannon off at 5 p.m. in downtown Cleveland and not hit anybody, one local real estate agent said of the city's decline, which is why city officials and real estate brokers lit up when they heard that the kid from Miami was coming to town. Shoket's excitement was palpable. He spun stories of falling in love with the city's architecture, with the historic nature of the buildings. Cleveland, he claimed, would be the perfect place to put his parents' money to work and to build a real estate empire of his own. He could be the savior the city needed, and unsuspecting locals lapped it up. He was the most important guy you've never heard of, as the Cleveland plain dealer described him. Shoket's first stop was 925 Euclid Avenue, the address of Cleveland's famed Huntington Building. Constructed during the Coolidge administration, it was once the nation's second-largest office tower, with the largest banking room America had ever seen. Its pediments featured murals by American painter Jules Guerin, capturing the spirit of the age. The building stood in many ways as a reminder of Cleveland's zenith and as a monument of unfulfilled promise. By 2010, the building was beaten down, with crumbled cornices, chipped corners, and old cabinets that were impossible to open. Nesting house sparrows found refuge inside, cohabitating in spaces abandoned by former tenants. The entire construct, just like downtown Cleveland, looked to most people like a cavernous husk of its former self. But not to Shoket. When he first arrived out front, he took in the building's mountainous scope. There was nothing like it in the Midwest, at least outside Chicago. A 1.3 million square foot colossus, a time capsule of what Cleveland once represented and what those in the city hoped to recapture. Inside, Shoket shuffled along the white marble floor, running his hands across the ribbed columns. He looked up at the century-old skylight. One of the locals accompanying him asked if he wanted to explore any of the other floors. This was basic due diligence, to make sure Shoket knew all that the building could be, and what work would be required to rejuvenate it. Shoket scratched his ink-black beard and shook his head. He'd seen all he needed to see. This building, this heirloom of Cleveland's boom-time past, would do just fine. He would buy it, but he did have a separate question. Instead of going through a lender, could he pay cash? In most cases, commercial real estate purchases go through a rigorous vetting process, with financing structures that involve corporate mortgages and third parties. But Shoket said he wanted the building as soon as possible, and said he wouldn't need any other parties involved for the purchase. Well, that would be just fine, one of the local representatives said, shaking Shoket's hand. To be fair to all the parties involved, there was no legal compunction for either the realtors or the local officials to say otherwise. Who wants to deal with all that extra paperwork when third parties are involved anyway? Nor was this move a surprise to anyone who knew Shoket. This was his preferred tactic, cutting out the financing middleman, streamlining the purchase, paying out of pocket. According to those who worked closely with Shoket, he'd done this before, all across the city, all across the Midwest writ large, in places like Cleveland, and small towns in Ohio, and Kentucky, and Illinois. He'd show up, walk around the lobby or the front lawn, look around for a few minutes, and then pledge to pay millions of dollars. Easy, efficient, done. He was good for the money, too. None of his previous multi-million-dollar checks had bounced. Besides, Shoket was charming and persuasive. He pledged that these purchases were just the first step toward a revitalization that would transform Cleveland once more into a global hub, a glorious return for a much-admired piece of America's Rust Belt. His fondness for this city is really apparent, one local developer named Deb Janik claimed, and those on the receiving end hardly wanted to ask too many questions about Shoket's money, or why he didn't appear to know or care much about the details of his new purchases. It's not as if Cleveland had many other suitors anyway. It's really a coup for the city to have someone like him investing, another developer swooned. But if they'd looked beyond Shokat's checkbook, they would have uncovered two things. First, as later court records and investigations showed, Shokat's claims of being smitten with the city appeared to be a complete falsehood, a story he spun to punt any questions into his financing. In speaking with those familiar with his operations, little evidence suggests that Shokat cared about Cleveland at all. Second, and perhaps more important, his sellers would have been surprised to learn that this was no rich kid playing and investing with his parents' money. In reality, his finances were linked directly to a post-Soviet oligarch named Ihor Kolomoisky, who posed as a Ukrainian steel and banking magnate, and who at the time was allegedly helping to run one of the largest Ponzi schemes the world had ever seen, conning depositors who used his Ukrainian bank. Kolomoisky was hardly a well-known name in the U.S., yet this Ukrainian businessman was not only the secret money behind Shokat's network, he was also a key oligarch, rising in power and wealth alike, threatening Ukraine's democratic trajectory while allegedly pilfering billions of dollars from unsuspecting Ukrainians along the way. On paper, Kolomoisky appeared as the head of Ukraine's largest private bank, dubbed Privatbank. But as Ukrainian and American investigators would later discover, Kolomoisky and his partner, Gennady Bugolyubov, had transformed Privatbank into their own private piggy bank. Cowing and threatening employees at the bank into doing their bidding, Kolomoisky and his partner allegedly swindled over $5 billion from unsuspecting depositors, disguising their thievery as loans and investments. However, Kolomoisky couldn't simply keep the looted money in bank accounts, which could be seized by authorities. He needed to hide it so effectively that no investigators, tax authorities, or international monitors would come after it. So, like Teodorin, he turned to the United States, where, as Kolomoisky knew, there was no finer place to hide and transform pilfered loot. While he was rarely directly involved in the U.S. operations, Kolomoisky had a network, fronted by Shokat and his team in Miami, that was more than happy, according to American authorities, to help the oligarch launder billions. With the young American as his loyal foot soldier, connected to the oligarch via a family network we'll detail in Chapter 4, Kolomoisky viewed the U.S. the same way Teodorin did, as a jurisdiction wide open for as much dirty money as he could provide. As far as I could tell, it was dirty money all the way, one American involved in Shokat and Kolomoisky's network told me. And it was all a washing machine scheme. They were all cleaning money. And Cleveland provided the perfect opening. Shokat could claim the money was for revitalization, which would persuade his unsuspecting local interlocutors. But the entire operation, as American officials later alleged, was a farce. Long and detailed investigations would later show that this was simply the tip of the iceberg. Using Delaware companies and Ohio steel mills, using investments in Texas and Kentucky and Illinois, and using a series of skyscrapers and office buildings in Cleveland, Kolomoisky could take full advantage of America's money laundering services, all to help clean the proceeds of his massive Ukrainian Ponzi scheme. But that wasn't all. It would take years, as the following chapters will reveal, for us to learn that this Ukrainian oligarch, who had become the kingpin of Cleveland, had also become the embodiment of something else entirely. For it wasn't just American money laundering that Kolomoisky was interested in. Rather, he was also interested in learning how to use all of these American networks, all these American operations for his own ends, how to exploit America's transformation into a massive, dirty money haven in order to bend U.S. foreign policy to his own will, how to manipulate the most corrupt American administration in generations into doing his own bidding, and how to use American kleptocracy to threaten the future of both the U.S. and Ukraine in the process. These two stories, of Teodorin as a despot cum dilettante pouring his ill-gotten money into American assets, and of Kolomoisky using a network of Americans to park his money across the U.S. in places he never thought anyone would look, act as a pair of case studies for the larger story of what this book is really about, how America became the largest provider of money laundering and financial secrecy services in the world, and who took advantage, and what it means for the rest of us. For years, the U.S. has largely turned a blind eye to the billions of dollars, and potentially more, in dirty and suspect money flooding into the country every year. stolen from national treasuries, or made via bribes, or smuggling, or trafficking of humans and drugs alike. Much of this money has, for the better part of the last few decades, come to the U.S. in order to be washed clean, to be transformed into legitimate assets, and to obscure any links to its previous criminal owners. All of which can be done in the U.S. perfectly legally. But in order to actually discern how America's transformation took place, and how Teodorin and Kolomoisky and all the other crooks and criminals detailed in this book took full advantage of America's implosion, it's worth defining a range of terms at the outset. The first is the classic of the financial secrecy lexicon, offshore. For many, the notion of a jurisdiction being offshore conjures up all kinds of images: swaying palm trees, white sand beaches, maybe a bit of Don Ho playing in the background. For the most part, these offshore havens of our imagination are small and secluded, dotting places like the South Pacific or the Caribbean. In a way, that imagined offshore isn't far from the truth. Nevis and the Bahamas, the British Virgin Islands and the Caymans, Mauritius and the Seychelles. These island chains and their sand-splattered neighbors have all built their own miniature offshore empires. They've all capitalized on the trillions of dollars in illicit capital sloshing around from tax evaders and drug cartels, wildlife poachers and human trafficking networks, corrupt officials and crooked regimes around the world. They've all gotten their pieces of the dirty money pie, and they all exist quite literally offshore. But that definition of offshore has been a misnomer since the late 20th century. It fails to account for a turning point toward the end of the Cold War, during a transition that just so happened to coincide with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. All of a sudden, the post-communist states opened to the West, and the communist apparatchiks were replaced by rapacious oligarchs, all of whom watched their net worth explode, mirroring the elite wealth gathering in other post-colonial regions. And it didn't take long for officials and industrial leaders in the U.S. to suddenly realize how they could profit from that transition. The marriage of American private property rights and American financial secrecy provisions presented an advantage that the tropical, sand-strewn islands couldn't compete with. It's not Panama or the British Virgin Islands or Switzerland that is now the best place in the world to launder assets, one Swiss lawyer enmeshed in the offshore world recently said. It's the United States. Those offshore havens still exist, but because of the U.S., whatever rhetorical lines that once existed between offshore and onshore have been effectively obliterated. Put another way, the world of the offshore has in a very real sense been brought back onshore, and with the U.S. at the middle, that offshore-onshore world has, over the past few decades, acted as a giant magnet for the kinds of dirty, illicit, and off-the-books money stolen from people and countries around the world, made via criminal regimes and criminal networks and criminal predations. The amount of money involved in this process has been staggering. To take just one data point, the pro-transparency organization Global Financial Integrity tabulated that developing countries had lost some $16.3 trillion in unrecorded capital flight since 1980, slightly larger than the entire GDP of modern China, making the offshore-onshore world something of a superpower in its own right. Compare that to the $135 billion, entire magnitude smaller, in annual global foreign aid, and you can see why these aid programs don't seem to make much of a dent. Part of that capital flight is a significant chunk of the tens of trillions of dollars of private financial wealth located in global financial secrecy havens. According to the best estimates, nearly 10% of all global wealth now exists in offshore havens abroad, and much of it is now hidden in the U.S., sucked into an offshore-onshore world that is, in many ways, simply too big to see. If this is all a surprise to you, you're not alone. The U.S.'s position as the world's leading offshore-onshore center hasn't gotten nearly the attention it deserves, and is one of the main reasons this book exists. It is often obscured by convoluted schemes that don't translate well into mainstream media coverage, or by jargon and technical terms meant to confuse outsiders. However, as the following chapters will reveal, it's a role and a reality that's been decades in the making. The second term to define up front is dirty money, which, for the purposes of this book, we can lump together with similar phrases like illegitimate assets, or ill-gotten gains. Dirty money remains a slippery topic to define, but it is, at its core, money gained via illicit or immoral means. It's not necessarily illegal. Theodorin procured millions, and potentially more, via perfectly legal means in Equatorial Guinea. But as we'll see in the first chapter, all of his wealth can and should be considered dirty, due purely to his proximity to his father's dictatorship, which is brutal by any definition. The same can be said for Kolomoisky. As we'll see in the third section of this book, all of his looted wealth was allegedly swiped via a Ponzi scheme of historic proportions. For the purposes of this book, dirty money is shorthand for any wealth gained by underhanded means. All wealth attached to dictatorial regimes, as well as their families and inside circles, should be considered dirty. So too should the wealth gathered by oligarchs acting as robber barons, and also the proceeds of trafficking or poaching or illicit drug dealing. To swipe a phrase, you know dirty money when you see it. If it smells dirty, if it looks dirty, then it's dirty and illegitimate and ill-gotten. But it doesn't always stay that way. Indeed, there's a kind of built-in inertia. Money emerges dirty and inevitably heads straight to the cleaners. It needs to get washed clean. It needs to become legitimate, which leads us to the third term worth defining: money laundering. The term is somewhat self-explanatory. It is, at its simplest, a process of transformation. Dirty money goes in, and legitimate money and assets come out. The transformation provides two benefits. Legitimate money can go much further. Actually, it can go anywhere. And investigators and journalists like myself are usually unable to trace the source, even after a diligent hunt for the moment it went from bad to good. In effect, you get new, sparkling, legitimate money or assets, while simultaneously snuffing out any evidence your money was ever tainted. There are 1,000 different ways to launder money, often involving cash businesses or purchases, as shows like Ozark, which involves a casino, and Breaking Bad, which involves a car wash, have illustrated. While plenty of these money laundering mechanisms will be detailed throughout this book, the key ingredients are usually all the same, though you'll be surprised to know that your favorite shows depict operations that pale in size to the real thing. Once dirty money is cleaned, it can be used for a wide range of activities. These can be as simple as enjoying the assets purchased, the mansions, the cars, the yachts, while turning the oligarch or despot into a self-styled celebrity. The money can also go towards setting up a nest egg for loved ones and future generations that investigators and authorities can't touch. With money comes protection, which is why it also goes into funding lobbyists and legislators who will prevent reforms or unsavory investigations. Likewise, with money comes status, which is why it also shows up as donations to Western universities and Western think tanks who will whitewash the reputations of the regimes and oligarchs in question, effectively using the laundered money to then launder reputations. It can, as we'll see in the book's final section, even go to funding lawyers and bagmen to whisper in an American president's ear about how to upend U.S. foreign policy, with none of us any the wiser. Those terms, offshore, dirty money, money laundering, bring us to our fourth and perhaps most misunderstood term, kleptocracy. It has enjoyed something of a renaissance over the past few years, thanks in no small part to the rise of Donald Trump and the kinds of practices and proclivities he perfected, which will be explored in the fourth section of this book. Emerging first in the early 19th century and initially used to describe Spanish organized crime, kleptocracy means, quite literally, rule of thieves, describing a regime dedicated entirely to predation and pillaging of the population. During Trump's presidency, it was fashionable to refer to his administration as a kleptocracy. A quick scan through some headlines of the Trump era highlights that fusion. How Donald Trump's kleptocracy is undermining American democracy. Vox. No to the Trump kleptocracy. Washington Post. Russian-style kleptocracy is infiltrating America. The Atlantic. All of these articles highlighted the Trump administration's range of unprecedented crimes, historic corruption, and penchant for authoritarian methods. But all of them misunderstand what kleptocracy truly is. Modern kleptocracy isn't something that can be attributed to one man, or one administration, or even one regime. It's not something that can be created, or crafted by an illiberal strongman or a blood-spattered dictator. Rather, it's a system involving multiple parties across multiple jurisdictions. It begins with individuals building empires of illicit and ill-gotten wealth abroad, and ends with those who, often in the U.S., welcome the dirty money with open arms, laundering the loot through perfectly legal tools like anonymous shell companies or sprawling real estate holdings or unregulated hedge funds, or Michael Jackson memorabilia. Kleptocracy is inherently multi-jurisdictional, journalist Oliver Bullough once wrote. To hide stolen loot, kleptocrats must move it across borders and obscure it behind corporate structures that make it look legitimate. And in the U.S., industries have sprung up to make sure that those trillions of dollars tied directly to noxious regimes or their oligarchic minions or the criminal networks tracing the globe can quickly become, poof, clean, legitimate, and available. In so doing, they have helped the U.S. become the greatest kleptocratic haven in the world and the biggest money laundromat known to man. And it's not just that all this staggering wealth can be masked using America's offshore-onshore services. Kleptocracy isn't simply the act of cleaning money. It also includes exploiting those funds to boost the reach and the reputations of regimes, oligarchs, crooks, and criminals of all stripes ad infinitum. Massive, sprawling networks now exist in the U.S. to make sure that the figures at the heart of this book are viewed and treated as philanthropists and financiers, as benefactors and allies, rather than the morally repugnant and criminal figures they actually are. The irony is glaring. The system transforms them into democratizers and pro-Western and reformist figures. As a result, investigations are blocked and reforms are stalled, all while these kleptocrats continue to expand and entrench their financial foothold and power. This can only occur systematically, rather than in a geopolitical vacuum or within national borders. It cannot exist in isolation, which is also why it cannot exist without culpable American lawyers, real estate agents, financial specialists, or PR professionals, aiding and abetting this sinister iteration of the American dream. And it's all legal. It's a phenomenon that should reframe our understanding of both domestic and international politics. Because in this kleptocratic environment, the West isn't the Cold War victor as understood in the popular imagination. Instead, another group appears to have won. The gangsters, the oligarchs, and the criminal networks masquerading as governments around the globe. The U.S., which helped make this world a reality, simply profited along the way. American Kleptocracy, anchored by the stories of Teodorin and Kolomoisky, reveals how we got here. Broadly, it is a story of how the U.S. transformed into the global leader in pro-kleptocratic industries and all that entails. It's also a book about key players in the fight to reform the U.S. systems. People like Carl Levin, a senator out of Michigan, who carved a career out of pushing anti-corruption and counter-kleptocracy policies, and how those reform efforts fell apart, assaulted by forces both within and outside the U.S. It's about how the Trump era was, in so many ways, the logical outcome of this trajectory, and how it always was, and always has been, bigger than a single administration, however corrupt. It's about a range of topics I've been researching and writing on for years, both as a journalist and member of the advisory board for the Hudson Institute's Kleptocracy Initiative, trying to catalog all of modern kleptocracy's myriad threads, its range of impacts, its players and patterns, and all that it says about capitalism in the 21st century. As this book lays out, dirty money doesn't infect only the places we may assume, like luxury real estate in Manhattan or beachfront condos in Malibu. It isn't limited to any specific geographic space or any specific financial institutions. Modern kleptocracy oozes into the nooks and crannies and unsuspecting corners of everyday life. It reaches into the public pensions and private endowments steered by private investors who are under no compunction to check the source of the money they're accepting. It smothers factories and mills across industrial America, those beating iron hearts of small towns whose best days are behind them, gutting any prospects of recovery. It captures entire state governments in places like Nevada and Wyoming and South Dakota, transforming those states into international offshore havens and outposts of financial secrecy of their own, which then block any and all efforts at reform. And it reaches into our own political system, upending elections and threatening America's democratic experiment in the process. All of this began before Trump ever arrived on the political scene, but he was the first global leader to emerge from one of the key pro-kleptocracy industries, American luxury real estate, and was a clear, obvious symptom of America's descent into the center of the offshoring world. While the end of Trump's term saw unprecedented, historic anti-kleptocracy reforms, those capitalizing on America's kleptocratic, offshore, onshore services are now beginning to steer American policy to their own ends, without any say from the public, and to strip the U.S. for parts, just as they've done elsewhere. This is a story and a trajectory that's been decades in the making. And it's a complicated story, full of interweaving parts and players, shadowboxing across industries and jurisdictions, involving those looking to launder their loot in the U.S. and those dedicated to stopping them. What follows is my attempt to untangle a broader phenomenon through a series of stories and characters that illustrate how we got here and what's at stake if we keep going down this path. It may be too big to see, but once you do, it will become impossible to ignore. Part 1. Stationary Bandits. I'm out in Cali. Why the fuck my company in Delaware? Lil Dicky. Chapter 1. The Soul Miracle. We will go through the motions. We will push democracy, but we'll live with what's put together there because we do not have any good options. We need their oil. American official on Equatorial Guinea. When Theodorin was born in 1968, Equatorial Guinea, a small hangnail of a nation on the Central African Atlantic coast, sandwiched between the much larger Cameroon and Gabon, was still a vestigial remnant of Spain's one-time empire. While much of Spain's power concentrated in Latin America, bookended by Christopher Columbus's voyages and Simón Bolívar's eventual wars of independence, Spain had also grabbed this small, Massachusetts-sized chunk of Central Africa, which it would eventually call Guinea Equatorial. By the late 1960s, as the wave of decolonization crested across Africa, calls grew for Madrid to join the march of European nations out of the African continent, and in late 1968, with Theodorin only a few months old, the Spanish government finally acceded. Equatorial Guinea gained its independence and was almost immediately subsumed by a newly established dictatorship under the rule of Francisco Macias Nguema. After Macias won the country's initial presidential election, he set the tone for the kind of governance the country would experience for decades thereafter, and the kinds of governmental predations and human rights violations that would condemn Equatorial Guinea to a pariah status for the rest of the 20th century. Macias destroyed the whole country. Ken Hurwitz, an American lawyer with the Open Society Justice Initiative, told me. Macias's alleged crimes ranged from the brutal, reportedly offing his main electoral opponent with the death formally listed as a suicide, to the fantastical, including burying the entire Equatoguinean treasury underneath his house and dubbing himself the Soul Miracle of Equatorial Guinea. Tens of thousands of Equatoguineans died or disappeared under Macias's decade-long rule. By the late 1970s, he changed his nickname to the Implacable Apostle of Freedom and became a genuine psychopath, added Hurwitz, who's tracked Theodorin's exploits for years. He would have been as famous as Ugandan despot Idi Amin if Equatorial Guinea had been bigger. Throughout his reign, Macias compiled a roster of domestic enemies. One of those, unbeknownst to Macias, until it was too late, included his nephew, who oversaw the National Guard and Equatorial Guinea's Black Beach prison, dubbed Africa's most notorious jail, where he was specifically tasked with torturing those who would dare to speak up against the Soul Miracle. That nephew was Theodorin's father, named Teodoro. Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, born in 1942, exudes an air of refined scholarship, with wire-rimmed glasses and prim suits. If you passed him on the street, you might mistake him for an accountant. Even when he was charged with torturing Macias's political enemies, real or imagined, he never gave off an especially intimidating air. Even when, in 1979, he turned on his uncle, leading to Macias's overthrow and execution, and announced the formation of the longest-running dictatorship in the world. It didn't take long for Equatoguineans to realize that Obiang's regime would offer much of the same as Macias's. Under Obiang, dissidents have disappeared, and independent media remains an oxymoron. He even tried to one-up his deposed uncle when it came to his outlandish claims, with state media proclaiming that Obiang is in permanent contact with the Almighty, and that he could kill without anyone calling him to account, which Obiang and his regime have done for decades without much consequence. In nearly half a century, Obiang has become a dictator who makes the other regional despots, those in Rwanda and Gabon and Cameroon, even the likes of Mobutu Sese Seko and Idi Amin, look restrained by comparison. At last check, Freedom House pegged his rule as the sixth most repressive regime in the world, between those in Saudi Arabia and North Korea. Reporters Without Borders scores the country's media freedoms worse than Somalia and Kazakhstan. In his 4 decades of rule, Obiang has managed to create a police state that rivals those of North Korea's Kim Jong-un and Syria's Bashar al-Assad in terms of rank brutality, but surprisingly, even exceeds them in terms of elite predation. The unification of the state with the ruler and the chutzpah of the corruption, the brazenness of the corruption, Hurwitz said, positions Obiang's regime as off the rails in terms of pure state capture. The dictator rarely pretends to have his population's best interests at heart. Not that many would necessarily believe him. Nearly 80% of the country lives in abject poverty, slogging by on subsistence farming and little else, with most Equatoguineans living almost completely outside the monetary economy. Over half the country has no access to clean water. Some 15% of the country's children die before reaching the age of 5, while a staggering 2/3 of those who survive don't stay in school past middle school. 1 out of every 3 Equatoguineans never sees the age of 40. None of this is different from the precedent Macias set. As one American official drearily summed up, the political leadership is illiterate and brutal in its crude way, but they know how to stay in power. And Obiang's regime has one key tool that allowed it to stay in power: oil. In the 1990s, after Equatorial Guinea spent years existing as what journalist Ken Silverstein, one of the leading reporters to catalog the family's malfeasance, described as a pariah state with few international allies, oil began gushing forth off its coastline. It was a gift of geography and the key to the kleptocracy that soon followed. The discovery lubricated everything, including relations with cloying Western governments in search of oil, who, in return, hoped to transform Equatorial Guinea into the Dubai of Central Africa, a glitzy, dictatorial regime and an indispensable energy hub. With riches comes protection, and Obiang benefited in 2 ways. First, the oil accelerated access to international resources in ways previously unavailable to a burgeoning despot. And second, any international criticism of his suffocating rule and human rights abuses was drowned out by an army of paid-off lackeys, lawyers, and lobbyists who operated on the regime's behalf. Before oil money came in, there was not a lot of money to steal, and when the oil money did start coming in, there were no safeguards in place, one local consultant admitted, watching Obiang's government siphon billions into his family's personal coffers that should have been spent on public works. There was no culture of government oversight, no media, let alone an independent media, no independent judiciary, and no outside scrutiny, because the country had been largely forgotten by the outside world. That all allowed corruption to flourish in ways it did in very few other countries. Nor was Obiang alone in such dreams about the doors the oil could open. His son, Teodorin, was in his early 20s when the oil burst forth, and suddenly enjoyed pride of place in a regime watching its annual oil revenues climb into the hundreds of millions of dollars, figures that would only continue climbing as oil prices grew through the turn of the century. The specific numbers, though, were almost so gargantuan that they became immaterial. When the oil started flowing, Teodorin suddenly had, in effect, unlimited wealth. Unlike his father, though, Teodorin wanted that money spent, and he wanted it seen. Unlimited wealth offered unlimited potential for him to upend entire industries, and, as we'll see, to exploit the mile-wide loopholes the U.S. provided to launder as much money as he could. Teodorin first arrived in the U.S. in the early 1990s to study at Pepperdine University in Malibu, California. That, at least, is what he claimed on his visa application. Instead of hitting the books, though, he began exploring and enjoying the kind of celebrity lifestyle he'd always wanted, the kind that Hollywood created, produced, and projected around the world. Almost immediately, he dropped any pretense of being a normal student. Rather than staying in dorms, Theodorin rented rooms at the Lux Beverly Wilshire Hotel. One former professor said that he loved to arrive on campus in a range of sports cars and limousines. He rarely came to class, the professor added. Late nights and bottle service, lavish meals and expensive rides. Theodorin loved it all, and all of it added up. His bills soon climbed to tens of thousands of dollars per month. However, he had a patron who would pick up the tab, Waller International, an oil firm out of Houston that had begun exploring Equatorial Guinea's oil reserves. As part of their explorations, executives at Waller International were willing to take steps to remain in the Obiang's good graces. Not that things were necessarily easy for the firm. One rep, according to Harper's, was reportedly pulling out her hair, trying to manage Theodorin's finances. Theodorin enjoyed all the Southern California trappings, the parties at his hotel, the late-night joyrides in his luxury cars, the benders that bled into the mornings during his time at Pepperdine, but he eventually tired of the pretense of being a student and announced he would be dropping out of the university. His father, by all appearances, was unsurprised by his son's academic failure, but he wouldn't let him remain in the U.S. Instead, he flew him back to Equatorial Guinea, where the dictator had an assignment for his son. The fact that Obiang wanted Theodorin by his side wasn't necessarily a surprise, though, according to those who knew them both, the two are hardly close and have never really been. The typical Equatorial Guinea kid does not tend to have a very strong relationship with their father, said Tutu Alicante. Theodorin was no different, instead spending much more time with his mother, Constancia. He also spent much of his youth apart from his father, living with extended family in neighboring Gabon, away from his great-uncles and, later, his father's dictatorship. But as Theodorin grew and his father aged, both of them realized that there was a significant problem to address: succession, and whom Obiang would appoint as his heir. As the eldest son, Theodorin was the natural heir. To be sure, even then, the dictator never thought much of his son's skill set, political or otherwise. The only reason Theodorin will be president is because he's going to kill everyone else around him, one former Equatoguinean official told me. But with Theodorin dropping out of Pepperdine, Obiang had an offer for his son, one that would allow his son to dip his toes into political waters, to get a feel for what dictatorship really required. He wanted him to become Equatorial Guinea's newest Minister of Forestry. Theodorin knew nothing about forestry management or timber harvesting, and was far more familiar with different hard liquors than different hardwoods. But timber was, and remains, the country's second largest export commodity, outpaced only by the flood of oil that continues to pour out. And Theodorin's father wanted someone he could trust overseeing such a lucrative industry. He also wanted his son to try to at least learn something, anything when it came to overseeing others, a skill set he'd need when he eventually succeeded his father. And Theodorin was only too happy to oblige, and to prove he could run the portfolio as effectively as his father expected. When oil was first discovered in Equatorial Guinea, American oil firms were quick to woo the family in order to access the country's fields. Feting Obiang and his family, they threw lavish junkets, paid for lavish entertainment, and hosted lavish parties, praising Obiang and his rule at every step. American oil companies couldn't outright bribe officials like Obiang. Such bribery was made illegal by the U.S.'s Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FCPA, which we'll revisit in Chapter 15, but there were workarounds available, such as overpaying the Obiang family's security firm for protection or offering to pay for the tuition of younger family members attending American schools, as Waller International was doing for Theodorin. On its face, the oil wealth should have belonged to the broader nation. It could have gone to buoy education budgets, health budgets, and infrastructure budgets, as it has in other oil-rich places like Norway or Alaska. But instead, the flush of new money went primarily to those at the top, to a predatory regime creating a patronage network to solidify and fund the country's dictatorship. It may not have been illegal. Obiang could simply rewrite the laws to make sure everything was technically legal, but it was clearly corrupt. Obiang directed the millions of dollars coming in every month in a series of different directions. Some of it went to security services dedicated to tracking and muffling, or worse, opposition figures. Some of it went to funding the military, keeping the country's army brass happy and preventing any coup similar to the one that had initially launched Obiang to power. And much of it went directly into Obiang's pockets, or into the pockets of his family and cronies, who continued to pledge fealty to the dictator, making all of them obscenely rich. Indeed, Equatorial Guinea may be the purest example of the resource curse described by political scientists, which sees economies built largely around a single commodity like oil, tending toward autocracy and dictatorship. Much of the country remains mired in poverty, stripped of any democratic rights, while those at the top watch their bank accounts continue to swell. Theodorin saw how his father dominated the country's oil industry, and he was well aware of the millions pocketed every month from the proceeds. He realized he could bring the same playbook to the country's timber sector. Shortly after assuming his new position, Theodorin immediately demanded the foreign timber export companies operating in the country pay a personal fee just to work, equal to 10% of the total export value of the wood they shipped. Malaysian companies, Filipino companies, European companies, African companies, all of whom, unlike American firms, had no restrictions on bribing local officials, agreed to Theodorin's terms. All of them would have to effectively bribe Theodorin just for the right to harvest the country's wide-open forests. Equatorial Guinea's beleaguered national forests were also available, for the right price. Theodorin would soon become known as the Minister of Chopping Down Trees. Yet those personal fees weren't enough. In 1996, he took things further, implementing a retroactive tax on these foreign companies, calculated at an extra $10 per cubic meter of timber that they had ever harvested from Equatorial Guinea. When a handful of companies refused to pay the new tax, he promptly confiscated their machinery, claiming the legion of bulldozers and backhoes as his own. Theodorin's interactions with one company, the Spain-based ABM lumber firm, encapsulated his corrupt management style. According to Antonio Cabanillas, who oversaw ABM's operations in the country, dealing with him was like dealing with a combination of Jimmy Buffett and Jimmy Hoffa. He would call us to come to his office, which meant wearing a suit and tie, Cabanillas remembered. He would keep you waiting for 5 hours and then appear wearing shorts. He would then tell you how much he wanted you to pay him, and that you had a week to do so. If they didn't hand over the money, they would lose everything. Even a company like ABM, which had been logging in Equatorial Guinea since the 1970s. That May, after Theodorin gave ABM 4 days to pay a retroactive tax of $1.5 million, the company balked. They refused the payment. But whatever political capital they thought they'd built up in the country, whatever reputation they thought they'd built in their decades-long efforts to ingratiate themselves with the regime, meant little in the face of the spurned son. Following ABM's refusal, Theodorin sent police to the company's local offices. They barreled through the firm's front doors and immediately evicted ABM's employees from the grounds. He then announced that they would all be banished from the country entirely, just for having the temerity to turn him down. We had to flee the country, Cabanillas recalled. He was demanding millions. But that wasn't all. Theodorin forced ABM's leadership, already in the process of packing to leave, to hand over control of its local forestry operations in their entirety, effectively nationalizing the firm, with all proceeds now heading to himself. Gracious as ever, the dictator's son paid a nominal fee for the transfer of ownership, magnitudes below the company's actual worth. He then followed this sale by arresting ABM's now former lead operator, who was only released after a $3 million payment. Theodorin, though, had little interest in actually managing the firm he'd just picked up. He forced a separate Malaysian logging company, Shimmer, which had already bribed Theodorin in order to harvest Equatorial Guinea's protected national forests, to purchase ABM's abandoned equipment. The cost to Shimmer, according to later court documents, came at significantly inflated prices, and all of it went directly into Theodorin's pocket. Considering that the annual worth of all of Equatorial Guinea's clear-cut timber ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars, all of these kickbacks provided Theodorin with a steady stream of seven-figure payments. None of this, of course, trickled down to the people, who remained among the world's poorest. But he continued to implement new taxes, and he continued to watch his swelling nest egg grow and grow. So he began asking around about how to transform all of that stolen wealth into something more substantial. He began to focus on the Persian Gulf, especially Dubai, where some of the world's wealthiest people spent their wealth. At the time, Dubai was already transforming from a sleepy desert enclave into a megalopolis, rising on the tide of the region's gas reserves. But after arriving in Dubai, Theodorn looked around and realized that plenty of others had the same ideas. He was hardly the only one with bottomless pockets popping up in the region. Rather than being a whale in a small puddle in Equatorial Guinea, Theodorn was suddenly one fish among many. Dubai is not his thing, one former Equatoguinean official told me. Everybody there has money like him, everybody has a car like him, so he doesn't feel like a prince. Theodorn then tried Paris briefly, which made sense. He'd learned French during his younger days spent in Gabon, and it was better than his Spanish. But Theodorn soon wore out his welcome, not least because he was filmed speeding down the Champs-Élysées in a Bentley, and later totaled another luxury car on the Paris streets, all between the days-long benders. But there was another option, one that other kleptocrats like him had begun looking to in greater and greater droves, one that was more than happy to help vacuum up billions. It was perfect. Theodorn could begin transforming his wealth into whatever he liked, and it was all perfectly legal, without any questions asked. Chapter 2. Why not do as the Americans do? In the Mafia, there's a special name for the people who discreetly remove all the traces after the act. Cleaners. The Panama Papers. The greatest financial secrecy tool the world has ever invented isn't something you can hold. It's not something you can see, or touch, or peer into, trying to ascertain what exactly it contains. It is, in a very real sense, something of a fiction. It exists solely on paper, and solely to conceal the names of the people and the sources of their money for whom it was created. It's called an anonymous shell company. Like regular companies, these anonymous shell companies can be registered quickly. A few phone calls, a bit of paperwork, and a new company can be had in a short period of time. On paper, it's often difficult to tell the difference between the founding of a legitimate company and the founding of an anonymous shell company. But where a regular company will soon begin building out its enterprise, hiring employees, creating its brand, selling its products and services, these anonymous shell companies almost never serve any legitimate purpose. Instead, they've done arguably more damage, caused more bloodshed, and obscured more dirty money than anything the world has ever known, all while cloaking more illicit and ill-gotten assets than we'll ever know about. And there's something the U.S. has been creating and selling for decades. For instance, in 1986, the Wall Street Journal featured a full-page advertisement aimed at readers in East Asia. The splash page featured a smiling photo of S.B. Wu, a lieutenant governor of Delaware, a small American state tucked between New York and Washington, D.C. on the country's eastern seaboard, a jurisdiction smaller than places like Kuwait or Israel. Wu had a simple question for the readers. Are you thinking of investing in the USA? One suggestion, in all caps for emphasis, declared, "Why not do as the Americans do?" The advertisement served as an effective launching pad for the lieutenant governor's tour through much of Asia. Alongside Michael Harkins, Delaware's Secretary of State, Wu visited businessmen, potential investors, and high-ranking officials alike. Touring Taiwan and China, Indonesia and the Philippines, Wu and Harkins had one goal in mind: to draw as much attention and as much money as they could to Delaware, a state few outside the U.S. had ever heard of or had much reason to. In the meetings they'd set up, Wu highlighted why those deep-pocketed officials and businessmen they met with should consider Delaware for all of their anonymous financial needs. The meetings raised few eyebrows. At the time, there were hardly any concerns about these kinds of companies. Instead, they were part of a far broader campaign of American outreach, searching out new markets to help spread the gospel of American capitalism, markets that Delaware wanted a piece of. Wu's travels took him farther than any Delaware official had ever been in an official capacity. He struck up a relationship with the Chinese ambassador and built up ties with regional exporters, as well as the wealthy Hong Kongers who would later funnel their wealth out of the island territory following its 1997 reunification with China. During all of these talks, one of Wu's favorite props was, according to New York Times coverage of the trip, a bilingual pamphlet. Despite the fact that it resembled something dreamed up by the National Lampoon back in the days when it was funny, it carried a simple promise to those in the turbulent region. We protect you from politics. The pamphlet pointed specifically to something that few of the businessmen and politicos they met with likely knew about. Wu and others had dubbed it an anonymous shell company, and it would allow all those they met with, and all of the millions of dollars those people controlled, to effectively disappear if the need should ever arise. On their face, there was nothing corrupt, and certainly not illegal, about these anonymous shell companies. The state of Delaware, known for being one of America's original 13 colonies, and not much else, had made them perfectly legal, and plenty of officials from American states similarly visited foreign environs on investment trips, especially toward the end of the 1980s and early 1990s. In that sense, the visit from the Delaware officials was no different. But this anonymous shell company product perked more than a few ears. A month after the Wall Street Journal ad ran, Filipino protesters ousted the gluttonously corrupt Ferdinand and Imelda Marcos, revealing to the world the details of Ferdinand's financial crimes. They also helped reveal things like Imelda's sprawling shoe collection, which ran into thousands of pairs. New Filipino authorities and long-suffering Filipino investigators began the process of tracking down the Marcoses' looted wealth in order to reclaim what rightfully belonged to the Filipino people. Doing so would also ensure that the couple couldn't enjoy any of their illegitimate assets after they were ousted from power. As such, Wu's audience in these non-democratic countries, skittish about potentially being overthrown or watching their financial lifelines dry up, was receptive. They were eager to hear more about these magical getaway-free tools, these anonymous shell companies that this small, distant state was selling. As they read the pamphlet, Wu's interlocutors learned just what these anonymous shell companies could do. By purchasing one of these anonymous shell companies in Delaware, they could enjoy all of the legal protections those in Delaware already enjoyed. In the event of an emergency in your home country, such as insurrection or invasion by a hostile power, the pamphlet read, your company can temporarily or permanently move its domicile and be protected by the laws of the state of Delaware. Of course, as Wu pointed out, the officials and businessmen he met with didn't need to wait for an insurrection or invasion. They could start purchasing and setting up these anonymous shell companies as soon as they liked. The campaign worked. Wu and Harkins ended up signing rafts of new clients excited by American financial protections. Delaware made some $1 million from their trip, a remarkable sum considering that setting up one of these anonymous shell companies in the state can run as little as about $100. But $1 million was just the beginning, and a sign of things to come. It was clear, as the New York Times reported that year, that thanks to these anonymous shell companies, Wu and Harkins had hit on a way of making everybody rich in the state, and that more would soon be flocking to happy Delaware. These anonymous shell companies are subsets of what we know as companies. Entities registered with government officials for purposes of commerce, contracts, taxation, and all of the capitalist wonders that come alongside. You've probably even heard of the variant called a corporation, a broad subset of companies, which provides many of the same services. There are some technical discrepancies between companies and corporations, but when it comes to the kind of money laundering services America provides, the two are effectively interchangeable. And in the eyes of the criminal and the corrupt, both serve the exact same ends, obscuring the origins of their wealth and transforming that suspect money into seemingly legitimate assets. For many, companies and corporations include familiar brands, Nike, Microsoft, Taco Bell, providing goods, services, and employment. They are relatively transparent, at least when it comes to their reasons for being. Their leadership is easy to identify. Their revenue numbers are easy to find. Their output, their new lines of sneakers, their new operating systems, their roster of burrito-related offerings is often just a quick Google search away. But this subset that Wu and Harkins were peddling exists as something altogether different. On the face of it, there's little difference when it comes to setting up a viable, legitimate company and an anonymous shell company. Both can be set up quickly, and both are registered with state officials. For the company service providers, those filing the paperwork and making sure all the payments and registration information are up to date, there's little way to tell at the outset whether they're helping a new, promising company register with the government or if they're helping set up the perfect financial getaway vehicle for a corrupt oligarch abroad. Still, there are some key differences. These anonymous shell companies don't provide any information on who's actually behind them, who, to drop in a technical term, their beneficial owners actually are. They have no shareholders or employees. They have no offices where actual business is conducted. They have no apparent purpose. If you manage to locate their records in corporate databases, you might find where and when they were formed, or even who filed their paperwork with the government to formalize their formation, but you won't find anything else. Instead, the only benefit is exactly what Wu and Harkins were selling: anonymity. And it's that anonymity that holds the key to the kingdom of kleptocracy, the necessary ingredient for transforming dirty money into legitimate financing and for removing all traces of the dirty money from its origins. Perhaps you're a cartel head with tens of millions of dollars from the opiate or fentanyl trade, looking to hide your assets from authorities and investigators. Perhaps you're a human trafficker, looking to hide the ownership of a series of illicit massage parlors. Perhaps you're an oligarch, worried about crossing your country's dictator, and you want to secretly funnel your assets out of the country. Or perhaps you're a family member of those running a despotic regime, and you realize that there's a revolution brewing, and you want to make sure that all of the lucre you've pilfered can't be reclaimed by the pro-democracy forces who will soon be coming to power. Anyone searching for anonymity, anyone searching to protect their assets, especially those of illegitimate origins, has reason to look to anonymous shell companies for succor. As one World Bank analysis of 150 major corruption cases found, the main type of corporate vehicle used to conceal beneficial ownership was the anonymous shell company. This comes despite a raft of major international agreements from the G20, from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, and others that have demanded their elimination. There are few, if any, legitimate business purposes employing anonymous shell companies, one financial crimes researcher summed up in 2014. Proponents disagree with the assessment, pointing to cases where that anonymity was necessary to avoid tipping off potential competitors, such as when Disney purchased the land for Disney World in Florida, doing so in secret in order to avoid landholders demanding higher prices. But those examples of legitimate applications of anonymous shells are sparse and buried by all of the other illicit uses to which these companies have been applied. If organized crime depends on financial secrecy, untraceable shell companies are the most important means of providing it, one group of researchers summed. Shell companies are the most common and important enablers of large-scale corruption. The process of using an anonymous shell company for laundering money is disarmingly simple. With an anonymous shell company, you can move your money almost anywhere, into almost any industry, into almost any sector, without detection. Since your name isn't attached anywhere to the anonymous shell company, pesky journalists can't follow your money, nor can any of the human rights activists tracking connections to brutal regimes, nor can investigators in democratic countries trying to figure out who's funding anti-democratic operations. Yet anonymous shell companies can do anything you need them to do: purchase buildings, skirt sanctions, bankroll political campaigns, or build financial empires without any of the rest of us having a clue. Anonymous shell companies have become the perfect financial get-out-of-jail-free cards and have helped move billions and potentially trillions of dollars clean out of sight. Say, for instance, you're a member of the ruling inner circle in a post-Soviet dictatorship like Kazakhstan. The country's brutal dictator names you the head of Kazakhstan Railways. It's a reward, he says, for years of loyalty, and it's a way of making sure the job goes to someone he can trust. You don't know the first thing about railway management, and you can hardly tell the difference between track gauges and Thomas the Tank Engine. But that doesn't matter. It turns out that running a nationwide monopoly on railways in a dictatorship like Kazakhstan is a great way to wring your populace dry and drain companies relying on the rails of any extra savings they may have been building up. As such, you start jacking up transit fees and demanding bribes from those requiring rail usage. You also keep landing massive no-bid contracts from the state, often for railways that lead nowhere. It's not like there's much that people can do given that you control all the rails, and that your buddy, Kazakhstan's thug-in-chief, has already disemboweled the country's independent media and political opposition. Your personal financial intake keeps growing and growing, but there's one hitch. Even as your net worth continues to explode, it's clear to all involved, to Western governments, to international anti-corruption investigators, even to a restive domestic population increasingly chafing under the decades-long corruption rotting their entire nation, that your money's no good, that it's ill-gotten, that it's dirty. Yet you still want to spend your money, or park it in assets abroad. You want to live among the caste of the world's wealthiest, with whom you feel you belong, but whose governments, at least nominally, look down on dirty money. And, anyway, you never know when the long-beleaguered population in Kazakhstan will erupt in revolution, with new authorities coming in, looking through corporate records, and seizing all your assets, as has already happened in neighboring Kyrgyzstan multiple times in the past 20 years. Enter the anonymous shell company, which services all of your laundering and anonymity needs. It will remove all trace of any suspicious origin from the money suddenly spilling out of your pockets. It will sever the link between the obviously dirty source of the funds and the funds themselves, and make it impossible for authorities and investigators to ever figure out who's actually behind the shell company in question. You know that when using an anonymous shell company, dirty money goes in and, poof, clean money or assets come out, unable to be traced to the initial bribe or embezzlement or cronyism that allowed you to grow so wealthy. Still, an anonymous shell company from Kazakhstan, a country overseen by a decades-long dictator saturated in corruption, would raise too many questions. But one from America? That's a different story. Thankfully, you've already met with someone like Wu. You've already listened to them describe how an anonymous shell company is a bit like a black box, a magical device that transforms dirty money into something that neither investigators nor authorities can unravel. And you're already aware that they're happy to sell anonymous American shell companies to any and all. So you give the Americans a call and ask them to set up an anonymous shell company for you, one that won't contain your name anywhere. You tell your contact you want to call it, say, Hiding Money, LLC. The American on the other end of the line says they'd be happy to set you up. It's in their best interest, after all, as they'll be taking fees along the way for their services, and there are no laws to deter them from setting up an anonymous shell for anyone they want. In as little as 15 minutes, you suddenly have one, this basic building block of modern kleptocracy. All it took was a phone call, a bit of your time, and an American who didn't care one whit about the source of your money. And suddenly, this magical black box is yours to use however you want, laundering and obscuring whatever funds you need it to. For many looking to launder their ill-gotten gains, this is the first step in constructing a modern kleptocratic network. These shells are the foundation upon which to build an offshoring empire. In order to use the anonymous shell company, though, you'll need a bank account. No problem. You call up your local banker, the one at the Kazakhstani bank, overseen by the dictator's oleaginous son-in-law, and tell him that you'd like to open a new account in the name of your brand new anonymous shell company. Absolutely, the banker responds. With a few keystrokes, a new bank account appears, now attached to your new anonymous American shell company. You then tell the banker to transfer, say, $100 million into this new account, plus an additional $10 million for the Kazakhstani dictator's son-in-law, as a gesture of appreciation for him and his family. A few minutes, a few phone calls, and it's done. Your name isn't attached anywhere, and international investigators, or the few remaining independent journalists in the country, will never be able to trace it to you. But your money is there, waiting to be transformed into mansions and mega yachts, Picassos and private jets, skyscrapers and stadiums and sprawling tracts of land, waiting to be bounced around into other new accounts elsewhere, or into anonymous trusts abroad, or anywhere else you'd like it to go, especially in a country like the U.S., which has let these shell companies effectively do whatever they've wanted to for years. All of it done completely anonymously. If this example seems a bit outlandish, just look at any dictator over the past few decades, those who've spent the better part of their time in power looting their nations, immiserating entire countries, and threatening American national security in the process. Peek below the hood of any dictatorship around the world, and you'll find a mountain of shell companies operating to help entrench the regime. Muammar Gaddafi, the deceased Libyan dictator, reportedly squirreled his and his country's fortune away inside a series of anonymous shell companies abroad. Slobodan Milosevic, the genocidal Serbian autocrat, he used anonymous shell companies to skirt sanctions and to continue his carnage against prone populations in Bosnia and Kosovo. Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un, all of them, including their family members and inner circles, have funneled untold billions through anonymous shell companies, far away from the eyes of their people and Western investigators alike. And more often than not, these dictators and their cronies and their oligarchs have turned to the U.S. to do it. If there's one central piece, one underlying rot at the heart of America's mutation into the center of modern kleptocracy, it's exactly that. The U.S. born and bred anonymous shell company. The ease of setting up an anonymous shell company in the U.S. is impossible to overstate. It's unclear where the first anonymous shell was formed, or exactly when, but it's clear that the U.S. has refined the product into an art, making it more efficient and more accessible than anywhere else. And that efficiency is one of the major reasons that the U.S. churns out millions of companies annually, more than any other country in the world, and more than the next 40 global tax havens, places like Malta and Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands combined. A few years ago, a trio of academics tried to uncover just which jurisdictions around the world had the easiest processes for setting up these anonymous shells. The experiment was straightforward. The researchers sent thousands of emails to company service providers, the people who, for a nominal fee, file the paperwork registering these companies so you don't have to bother yourself with the details. Sometimes the academics posed as Danish consultants, simply looking to help a client, while other times they posed as government officials from notoriously corrupt countries like Pakistan, trying to whisk their gobs of stolen wealth out of the country. But the three always asked, in effect, the same question. If they wanted to set up an anonymous shell company, how easy would it be? The results were striking. Nearly half of the company service providers didn't bother to require identifying documents certified by any government body, and more than a fifth didn't even require any photo identity documents at all. As one of the researchers pithily wrote, disturbingly, the results presented here suggest that those selling shell companies are almost completely insensitive to the danger of corruption. And one country stood out more than all others, the U.S., where setting up an anonymous shell company was obscenely easy. Given the capitalistic, deregulatory ethos of the country, it makes sense that the most efficient means of setting up these anonymous shells would come in the U.S. Plus, there's an entire industry already built up to service legitimate, perfectly above-board companies in the U.S., an industry whose tools just so happen to work perfectly for corrupt officials or narco-traffickers or foreign oligarchs trying to set up anonymous shells as well. But the ease with which American company service providers set up these shells still shocked the researchers. As they found, all it required was as little as $100 and as few as 15 minutes on the phone with a company service provider to walk you through the paperwork. All you need is a name for the company and a check made out to the company service provider, or, better yet, direct payment from a foreign bank account, preferably one that U.S. authorities couldn't trace even if they wanted to. If you want, you can even select what's known as a nominee, a front person who will act as the anonymous shell company's director, shareholder, or partner. Someone who could, if authorities come knocking, claim to be the only person involved with the company. But don't worry, in the U.S., these nominee figures never need to know your real identity either. And if that's not enough anonymity for you, you can even layer your anonymous shell company operations, with shells, owning shells, bouncing across states, across oceans, across the world, burying your identity under a matryoshka doll of shells, each one nested inside another, each one as anonymous as the last. The researchers found that less than 10% of American company service providers requested basic identifying information, and only a minuscule 1.5% of the company service providers in the U.S. complied with international best practices. A person searching for a provider willing to violate international standards could start searching at the beginning of the day and probably be finished by lunch, the researchers